Good evening. My name is Dr. Shakti. So we're going to be going to the second chapter in your respiratory system. Previously, we had done with the basics of mechanics. So, you know, today the topic's going to be a cocktail of a lot of things, but it's very difficult to cover everything in 1 hour. Uh, you know, if you include both mechanics and your ventilation, perfusion, and all that. So we're going to cover these two in two separate classes. And today we're going to be also talking about your pulmonary circulation along with the remaining of your mechanics, like your surfactant compliance, pulmonary ventilation, ventilation perfusion ratio, and all that. Okay. So just to have an idea of what sort of questions come from this topic, here you can see long essay on pulmonary ventilation. So they're asking you the different factors that affect the pulmonary ventilation. Then you have shorter questions about lung compliance and its clinical significance. Then describe ventilation perfusion ratio. This is very often asked as a question. Then outline the pulmonary circulation. So this can sometimes even come as a long question. So this has to be also studied properly. Then what is the normal value of ventilation perfusion ratio again? Primary function of pulmonary surfactant compliance. So you get the gist of what you have to learn. You have to understand what is pulmonary ventilation. You have to understand what is compliance, what is surfactants. Then you'll have to understand what is ventilation perfusion ratio. And before that, we have to understand what is pulmonary circulation. Okay. So we're going to start this off by understanding about your pulmonary circulation. So when you talk about your pulmonary circulation, I'm just gonna draw the end parts of your tracheobronchial tree. We had already covered the Weber palette model of the tracheobronchial tree yesterday. So now, as it is splitting, and eventually it is going ahead. So I'm just drawing a crude one, and we have the alveoli. Okay, in between them, there are multiple divisions, which I'm not showing again. So what you have to understand is, we have a vasculature which is coming, which is your pulmonary artery, which is carrying your deoxygenated blood, and it is going to different parts of your tracheobronchial tree. Okay. On the other hand, we have another system, which is your pulmonary vein. Okay, so this pulmonary vein is carrying your oxygenated blood. Okay, so the one which is going into your alveolar level, oxygen diffusion is taking place, and it's carrying your oxygenated blood. Now, this is where you have to understand, apart from this, there is another set of blood supply which is coming. So from here, you have another oxygenated vessel which is going, especially to the bronchial areas. Okay, so this is your bronchial vessel. This is your bronchial artery. And that bronchial artery will get deoxygenated as it gives supply, and it will finally drain itself into the pulmonary vein. So what happened? You had oxygenated this blood. Now this oxygenated blood is going through the pulmonary vein and going back to the heart. But a small fraction of deoxygenated blood has just entered into this. This is what we call a shunt. So because of the presence of this shunt, the blood can usually never be 100% saturated. Oxygen saturation will never be 100%. Usually it is less than that. Okay, so one reason is this. The other reason is, when you learned about coronary circulation, some of the veins through your superficial system can bypass and go directly and go to chambers of the heart. Okay, so when it happens like that, some deoxygenated blood can also mix. So these are two reasons why some sort of physiological shunting is happening. What is it ultimately affecting? The oxygenating capacity. So just that, it's not going to be 100%, but it's still, usually 97%, something like that. You usually do see it mostly. Okay, this is how the arrangement of your pulmonary vasculature is, and just the importance of your bronchial artery and the shunts. Okay, so most commonly bronchial artery is coming from your thoracic artery. Most commonly, not all the time. Now, once this structure is understood, we go on to understand your pulmonary circulation and how it is different from your systemic circulation. So we have the pulmonary circulation, and how is it different from your systemic circulation? So one thing is this vessel, pulmonary vessels are wider. Second thing is they are shorter. They are thinner. They have lesser musculature. The smooth muscles are lesser number. Okay. They have more number of divisions compared to your systemic circulation. Okay. So as a result of all of this, what is going to happen? Because they have more number of divisions, the total cross-sectional area will be less. I'm sorry, it will be higher. Okay, because it has less musculature, the tone will be lesser, which means your resistance will be lesser. It said that, the peripheral resistance will be usually 0.08 peripheral resistance unit. That is, for comparison, 1/10 of the peripheral resistance of your systemic circulation. Now, as a result of this decrease in resistance, that also will eventually result in a decrease in the pressure. Okay, so what do you understand over here? The resistance is less, okay, and this is a low pressure system. Because if there is high pressure, what will happen? It can lead to pulmonary edema and all these complications. Okay, so it has to be maintained as a low pressure system. Resistance should be less, okay, and because it is thinner, the compliance will be higher. So when the compliance is higher, it is able to accommodate more. What is the importance of that? It acts as a sort of a reservoir for your left ventricular system. We were talking about it yesterday. So usually around 250 to 400 ml can be there as a reservoir. Some textbooks even give a value like, 440 ml. Okay, so ideally they act as a reservoir. Now, apart from that, if you are to talk about the transit time, the circulation time, okay, the circulation time of 1 RBC. 1 RBC is around 0.75 seconds for crossing the entire pulmonary circulation. Okay, so that is at rest. On the other hand, during exercise, it can go up to 0.3 seconds during exercise. So these are some peculiarities of the pulmonary circulation. So again, if a question comes, what are the peculiarities or specific peculiarities of your pulmonary circulation? How do they differ from your systemic circulation? You can jot down all of these points. Just one more peculiarity. Generally, when there is any sort of a hypoxia, okay, in the systemic vasculature, there is generally going to be a vasodilation. Instead, in your pulmonary circulation, you'll see a vasoconstriction. Okay, this is because of some potassium dependent channels which are acting, oxygen dependent potassium channels which are acting. Exact cause is still not known, but one of the postulate mechanisms like that. Okay, so this is all the different points of your pulmonary circulation. Now, when you talk about the pulmonary circulation, it should have some sort of pressure. We said it's a low pressure system. Okay, your normal systemic vasculature has a 120 by 80 millimeter of mercury. Okay, in your pulmonary circulation, it again should be shifting between your systolic and diastolic BP like this. The highest point over here, the systolic BP, that is usually around 25 millimeter of mercury, and the lowest point will be around 8 millimeter of mercury. And the mean is going to be somewhere around 15. Okay, so this is in your pulmonary artery. Now from here, imagine it going into your pulmonary capillaries. So what you notice is this pressure, mean arterial pressure, will drop to a value of 12 around the start of the pulmonary capillary. And by the time the end of the pulmonary capillary happens, it goes to a value like 9 millimeter of mercury. Okay. Now, beyond the pulmonary capillary, we have the left atrium. And in the left atrium, this pressure will further go to the value of 8. Just a mean value that we're talking about. This can range between 4 to 12 millimeter of mercury. So this can be measured by what we call pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. Okay, so in pulmonary capillary wedge pressure, we put a catheter through one of the great veins. From there, we keep going and you go reach this point and wedge it at the pulmonary capillary level. But in turn, what are you essentially measuring? The pressure in the left atrium. So this is very important in understanding pathologies in left-sided problems. Okay, like for example, mitral stenosis is there. Okay, or left atrium is not, the left ventricular problems are there where it's not, ejecting enough, so the pressure will build up. So all of these things you can understand from understanding about the pulmonary capillary wedge pressure. This again, sometimes can be part of an essay as a note. That is why I've given it to you here. Okay. So now that this is understood, a very important point about pulmonary vasculature. So I just draw 3 things like this. Just bear with me. This is again a diagram you have to draw and explain a certain concept. Okay. So on one side, we have the pulmonary arterial pressure. The other side, pulmonary venous pressure. Okay. And here we have the alveolar pressure, pulmonary alveolar pressure here. Inside it will be the pulmonary capillary. The pressure of that will denote by P cap. Okay. Now, if we take a look at your lungs, Now, from the top level to the bottom level, there is around 30 centimeter of difference. If you know the formula of mean arterial pressure plus or minus 0.77 into x, that x is how many centimeters away from the heart. Okay, based on that, you will be able to calculate. So, for example, if you replace it by this 30 centimeter, you know that around 23 millimeter mercury of difference is there in the pressure from the top to the bottom. Okay, so with respect to your heart level. Okay, this heart level, on top, it is usually minus 15 millimeter of mercury, and down at the bottom, it is around 8 millimeter of mercury. So this is the difference in the pressure as you go up because of the effect of gravity. Now we're coming back to this. Okay, so what you're understanding is as you keep going up, the pressure is dropping. If you keep going down, the pressure is increasing. That is what you're supposed to understand from this. Okay, so imagine an instance where your pulmonary artery pressure is there. That is less than your alveolar pressure. So the alveolar pressure, which is exerting from outside, this is higher than even your arterial pressure, which will definitely be higher than your capillary pressure. So what will happen? The artery and the capillary will be narrowed and even be collapsed. This is what we call a zone 1. This is one kind of zone that can exist. Zone 1, where they are collapsed because alveolar pressure is higher. Okay. Now, another scenario is your pulmonary arterial pressure is high, alveolar pressure, then your capillary pressure is lower. So what will happen? Initially, the pulmonary artery pressure, because it is high, this part will be a little enlarged because this pressure is higher. And then since the capillary part, your alveolar pressure is higher, that will be collapsing. So there will be some areas where there's a collapse, some areas where there won't be a collapse. So that kind of a zone is what is called zone 2. Okay. On the other hand, your pulmonary arterial pressure, pulmonary capillary pressure is all more than your pulmonary alveolar pressure. Then at no point is it being collapsed. Instead, it will either be enlarged or remain the same. Okay, this is what you call a zone 3. So there are 3 types of zone when you talk about your pulmonary vasculature. Again, questions come where you have to draw this and try to explain this. The zones in the lung with regard to your pulmonary circulation. Okay, so in your lungs, generally take your heart, okay, and go say 10 centimeter above it and take that point. Now, from that point up, you usually see zone 2 normally. And from that point below is where you see zone 3. And it makes sense because, you know, as we keep going down, the pressure increases is what we learned. So eventually these pressures will be higher as you keep going down. So higher probability for zone 3 to exist down. Okay. Above the apical parcel, zone 2 exists. Zone 1 does not normally be present in your lungs. Okay, zone 1 is usually not present in lungs, but it can be present in certain conditions where Either your alveolar pressure becomes very high. Okay, this pressure becomes high, or these pressures drop for any reason. So when does your alveolar pressure become high? You do something like Valsalva maneuver. Okay, if the closed glottis expire against a closed glottis, the pressure here will increase. So what do you call a Valsalva maneuver? Or, say in COVID and all, what we were doing, you give a positive ventilation. From outside, you give ventilation and inflate everything and give extra pressure. That will sort of create a zone 1 in some areas. Okay, so a positive ventilation that you give. On the other hand, sudden acute hemorrhage is there, and blood loss and all is there. That will reduce this the pressure in the artery. So in those two scenarios, a zone 1 can be present. Otherwise, normally zone 1 is not present. Now again, in exercise, or a person goes supine. In that case, what happens? The zone 2 can get converted to zone 3, and the entirety of the lung, especially in exercise, can become zone 3. This is through certain peculiarities where, one, in exercise, for example, your cardiac output will increase, all that, and because of that, blood flow increases. Okay, blood flow increases, the pressure also increases. And apart from that, two things you have to note. That is, one, distension. Distension is where already, patent existing your vessels, they dilate to allow better blood flow. Okay, that is distension. Apart from distension, there is something called recruitment. So previously closed, or narrow vasculature gets opened up. So actually at rest, there are a lot of vasculature which are not actually used, which actually goes into something called physiological dead space. Okay, now when there is requirement, you can in fact convert your zone 2s into zone 3 by doing things like distension and recruitment. Okay, so these are all various important things you can talk about with regard to your pulmonary circulation. So we'll just take a look at a couple of MCQs which are there, which are the following occurs in pulmonary circulation, but not systemic circulation. Remember that second part. Okay, low pressure, high flow system. So low pressure, we know pulmonary circulation, low flow, but your systemic circulation is not a low pressure system. Second point, higher oxygen content in veins and arteries. So this is a very easy question. Autoregulatory control is there both in systemic circulation and pulmonary circulation. And the fourth one makes absolutely no sense regarding this question. So this is the best option of the lot. Primary function of pulmonary circulation is to supply nutrients to the lung tissue. No, that is basically your bronchial artery is there for that. Okay, so this is mainly to result in gaseous exchange, as we had seen earlier. Now we need to understand another concept. Now that we understood your pulmonary circulation, we understood a little bit about your ventilation and all that. Okay. Now we understand what we call ventilation perfusion. Ventilation perfusion ratio. So what we were talking about earlier, we have the lung again, and we have the top part and the bottom part. What did we see so far? When we move up, what happened to the perfusion? Perfusion, it decreases. Yesterday we had seen how when we go up, ventilation is actually also reducing. How? It's based on something we talked about yesterday. So the intrapleural pressure in the lung, okay, the pleural pressure which is there, it is not constant throughout. This is because, the top part, we have your pump handle movement where, all these accessory muscles are there. Your scalenus is there, okay, serratus is there, you have your trapezius, you have the intercostal, okay, apart from your diaphragm, of course. So, because of the effect of all of this, the top part compared to the rest actually has a greater negative intrapleural pressure. The intrapleural pressure when we were talking about yesterday, which is -2 to -6 during tidal respiration, that was actually the value at the base we were talking about. Okay, on top it goes to usually 10 -10 centimeter of water and all. Okay, so that sort of a difference is there in the intrapleural pressure. So because of that, what is going to happen? The alveolar over here are already pretty well distended because the intrapleural pressure at rest itself is higher compared to the one which is there less below. So here at rest, they are smaller actually. So when they are smaller, they have a higher scope to become bigger and accommodate more air than on top. So this is one of the reasons why as you go up, the ventilation is also dropping. Okay, perfusion is dropping, ventilation is also dropping. But when we look at something called the ventilation by perfusion ratio, okay, somewhere around the middle, it is around 0.8. Now, once you go to the top, it is around 3. And once you go to the bottom, it is around 0.6. Okay, so what your understanding is, although both perfusion and ventilation falls as you go on top, the fall in perfusion is much more than the fall in ventilation. Because of which the ventilation perfusion ratio is much higher, especially at the apex. This is important when you talk about certain clinical scenarios like, TB, for example. Why? There is higher probability of diseases like this to exist in the apical part of the lungs because ventilation is very good comparatively, and the perfusion fall is much more. Okay, so these are some things that I want you to understand. Okay, so understanding this, we'll just look at a few questions. Which of the following best describe the ventilation perfusion ratio at the lung apex? We already saw it is greater than 0.8 due to reduced perfusion. Exactly, it's coming to around 3. Ventilation perfusion mismatch is least likely to occur. So this might be a difficult question for some of you. We'll try to understand again. Why was ventilation? There are 2 components here, ventilation and perfusion. Okay, so if anything affects either the perfusion or the ventilation, it can result in a ventilation perfusion mismatch. Okay, we were talking about how because of the size of alveolar, intrapleural pressure, all that, there is how much ventilation can happen. That is something we were talking about. So when there is atelectasis, what is atelectasis? Basically, collapse of that lung. Okay, that parenchyma has collapsed. So ventilation is not there. Blood flow might still be there. Okay, so now there is a ventilation perfusion mismatch. If you talk about pulmonary embolism, okay, imagine an embolism is coming and obstructing your perfusion. So perfusion is affected, so ventilation perfusion mismatch is coming. Okay, in emphysema, already everything is expanded a lot. Okay, there's not much scope to expand more. And the thing is, in emphysema, they become very thin. The connective tissue around becomes thin. So they have a greater tendency to collapse, although they can expand a lot. So again, ventilation is affected there. Okay. Uh, Again, pneumothorax also can result in a ventilation perfusion mismatch because a large scale pneumothorax can result in changes in the pleural pressure and in turn can affect your ventilation. Okay, but out of the lot, that is the best option. That is all. It's not like pneumothorax does not result in ventilation perfusion mismatch. It does. Okay, but compared to the other option, that looks like the safest answer that you can give here. A patient has reduced ventilation perfusion ratio in the base of the lungs. This is also pretty simple. Okay, the perfusion is much more higher related to ventilation. That is why it's a 0.6. So definitely perfusion is higher than your ventilation over there. Okay, so those are certain things that we need to talk about ventilation perfusion ratio. Now coming to this thing called factors affecting pulmonary ventilation. Remember that first question, long essay that we were talking about. So these are the headings under which I want you to write about it. In case it comes as a long question. Generally it doesn't, but in case it comes as a long question, I want you to remember these headings. What is again pulmonary ventilation? Pulmonary ventilation is how much air is moving in and out of the lung in a unit time. That is pulmonary ventilation. So you take 1 minute, in 1 minute, how much air is moving out in and out of the lung. That is pulmonary ventilation. Okay. There's another term called alveolar ventilation. When you say alveolar ventilation, when we talk about how much air is coming into the alveolus and taking part in respiratory exchange. So in that scenario, the volume that is coming in and out minus the dead space into the respiratory rate. That is how you get your alveolar ventilation. Okay, otherwise simply the volume which is coming in and out into the respiratory rate, that is going to be your ventilation per se. We call it respiratory minute ventilation. Okay, so this is affected. What are the factors affecting it? One, the airway. Imagine the airway is very narrow. Diameter of the airway is important. How much resistance is offered in the airway will also affect how much is going to come in. This can be manipulated by one, your vagal tone. Okay, vagal tone with respect to your M3 receptors, it can result in constriction. Okay. Now, apart from that, your humoral system releasing catecholamines. In fight and flight reaction, it should dilate. Okay. Then, of course, there are other substances like histamine, leukotriene, and all, which can result in constriction. So this is what happens in asthma. Okay, histamine, leukotriene, and all that is involved there. Now, apart from that, lung volume by itself can affect the airway resistance. At lower lung volumes, like the residual volume, resistance is higher. As the volume increases, the resistance is less. This is because of something called tethering. They're all interconnected to each other. Okay, and when they are narrowing down, they pull the other ones. So there's some nature called tethering which is happening, because of which this phenomenon is. So that is the first point you have to talk about. And again, you can talk about your Poiseuille formula and all, and how you can talk about the flow is dependent proportional to 8 eta L by pi r raised to 4. So 4 times the radius inversely proportional. So you can talk about all of these things under the first point. Second point is pressure gradient. Pressure gradient is everything we were talking about yesterday. Okay, we talked about the interpleural pressure, interalveolar pressure, transpulmonary pressure. We drew 3 diagrams which is there in Gano. So that is something you have to explain in detail under this heading. Okay, to result in difference in the pressure outside and the inside, and how it results in pulmonary ventilation. Okay, there's a whole chunk of things that you have to cover out there. These two we partly, talked about them yesterday. Now, today, what we're going to complete is surfactant and compliance. Okay, so now if this comes as a question, you can incorporate all of these together and write an answer. Okay, so first thing, we're going to talk about your compliance. So in compliance, what we're talking about is how much change in volume is happening for a unit change in pressure. For example, say your pressure is changing from minus 2.5 to minus 6 millimeter mercury, the intrapleural pressure. Now that change normally brings about 500 ml of volume. Okay, imagine the same pressure is bringing in about just 150 ml of volume. What does that mean? Everything is the same, pressure is the same, but the volume is not the same because the lung is not compliant for some reason. We see that the compliance is less over there. On the other hand, it is going to 800 ml in another person. You see that that person's compliance is better. So that means for the same change in the pressure, unit change in the pressure, how much change in the volume can happen. That is what we're trying to explain over here. This is a property of your lung. Okay, so one guy, he did an experiment in cats. So what he did, he tried putting different pressure and looking at the volume. So he was able to plot pressure versus volume changes during inflation. Okay, and what he noticed was he got a graph like this. What does it mean? You take a unit change in pressure changing from this point. I'm taking this as a unit pressure. So this much change in pressure, how much of the volume has changed? This much. Now, say I take somewhere over here, the same unit change of pressure. Okay, for the same unit change of pressure, how much volume has changed now? This much of volume has changed. We go somewhere over here. For the same unit change, what do you see? This much of volume. So what do we understand here is, at the beginning, lung is not that compliant during at the initial parts. That is at lower volume. Okay, and at the end, it is not compliant. In the middle, it is compliant. Okay, this is where we have to understand a particular law called the Laplace law. Since it is alveoli and hence a spherical surface, the formula will be P proportional to 2T by R. So what it means is, if the radius is less. So at the beginning, radius is less and then it expands and then radius becomes high. Okay, so at the beginning, when the radius is less, in order to maintain the same tension, you will need to put higher pressures. That is what we saw here. So much of change of pressure needs to be put. Same amount of pressure you put, see how much volume is increasing. Okay, so especially at lower radius, tension as such. Okay, so because of that, the reason for this is the surface tension is higher over here. So what is the reason for the hysteresis. We call it hysteresis. We expect a curve to be straight, but it has changed. Okay, so that confusion is now what we call hysteresis of compliance curve. The compliance curve hysteresis during the initial part at lower radius can be explained by Laplace law, and how it is because of surface tension. Okay, now at the other end, as it keeps expanding, expanding, and expanding, the elastic recoil for it to come back, that is what is reducing compliance. Now, while deflation, you will see that it will come back like this. Now, the same person, what he did was, he did a very brilliant thing. You put the cat, the lung was submerged in fluid. So now there is no air fluid interface. Surface tension is only there if there is an air fluid interface. Now the same curve, you see it going up like this. And then he tried inflating. So now that initial part, the hysteresis is no longer there. So thus it was sure that it is in fact because of surface tension that resulted in a hysteresis in the compliance loop in the lower parts, and at the end it was because of elastic recoil. Okay, now again, two specific things I have to talk about when we talk about compliance. Compliance is one, what is static compliance? Okay, that is essentially change in volume by change in pressure. But how do we measure that in a living person? So you know, this is usually measured in people with ventilators. So you measure the tidal volume. Okay, you measure a particular pressure called the P flat. So you take a breath at the end. That is the plateau. Okay, so that plateau, this point here, that is when you take the pressure. Minus peak expiratory pressure. That is while you expire at the end of this. It's not zero. Some pressure we'll put so that it doesn't collapse. So this will give you the value for static compliance. This is where you have to understand another terminology which is called dynamic compliance. What is the difference? So in static compliance, what are we doing? Now this point we record. This point we record. So two ends where there is some sort of a plateau or end point, that is where you're measuring it. But you are not taking into consideration the recoil, the resistance, elasticity, all of these things. For that, we need to measure somewhere here. Okay, so that is the peak that we have to measure. So the tidal volume by P, peak inspiration. So you usually call it PIP minus PEP. Same thing. So now this will give you what is happening in between, where components like your resistance, elasticity, okay, all of this is coming into play. This is what you call dynamic compliance. Now there's another type of compliance which is called specific compliance. What is specific compliance? So again, on top is volume, bottom is pressure. So imagine you're comparing a child, an infant, and an adult. If there is compliance, can you see that, okay, the compliance is higher in an adult? The lung volume itself is higher in an adult. Okay, so obviously the delta V is going to be higher over there. You can't say that the compliance in that person is higher just because the surface area is so much lesser in a kid. Or you take an adult only. One adult who has two lungs, another adult who has part of his lungs gone. There's no problems in his compliance. Compliance is the same for the lung. It's working well. The normal lungs is working well. The other lungs is gone. But now when you measure the delta V, the volume is less because he is only using one lung. The other person is using 2 lungs. So for such problems, we use the specific compliance, where you take the value of static compliance and divide it by functional residual capacity to make it equal. Okay, so that is why we have all of these different terminologies. Now again, compliance, the normal value of lung compliance is 0.2 liter per centimeter of water. Your chest wall compliance is also 0.2 liter per centimeter of water. Now we have to understand the total compliance. 1 by total compliance is equal to 1 by lung compliance plus 1 by chest wall compliance. Hence, it is going to be 0.1 liter per centimeter of water. Just some values for you to remember in case it comes to MCQs or some sort of calculations. Okay. Now that we understood this, compliance of lungs decreases significantly in. Here, fibrosis is where your lung parenchyma gets fibrosed, because of which compliance is not there for the lung. Pulmonary compliance can be described as the ability of lungs to expand for a given pressure. Which of the following accurately describes the compliance in the lung? That is again change in lung volume per unit change in pressure. Okay, now this is where we have to understand surface tension. So we already told you about how surface tension was present. Okay, now you can see here, surface tension is the force acting on an imaginary line 1 centimeter at the air-liquid interface. Okay, now if you were to see over here, each of these molecules, they are being pulled on either side. This molecule over here is pulled on all directions. Okay, that is being pulled on all directions. So can you see here? This is being pulled on all the directions. Just a second. Okay. So you can see here. Here, this is being pulled 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 here. Every direction is being pulled equally. But at the air fluid interface, what will happen? It is being pulled here, 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 it is being pulled here. But something is not pulling it here. It's air over there. So the resultant effect is all of these particles being pulled inward. Okay, so this is your surface tension. Okay, now this, to combat surface tension and to increase your compliance a little better, we have something called surfactant which is being produced. We have type 1 cells and type 2 cells which are there, okay, at the level of your alveolar. In that type 2 cells, can you see here, they from the rough endoplasmic reticulum produce something, protein, to Golgi, it will go into something called composite body, then it goes to lamellar body. And slowly from the lamellar body, it will release into the fluid inside the alveolus as what we call tubular myelin. Okay, the most important component of it is this dipalmitoyl phosphatidyl choline. Okay, this is more of a lipid structure, phospholipid kind of a structure. Okay, so each hour the normal lung secretes into the alveolar space 10% of the material in the lamellar body. Okay, and that is your tubular myelin that you see. Now, this tubular myelin can be degraded by alveolar macrophages eventually with time. Okay, now again you can see here how this is being reduced and tubular myelin is formed, and you have these surfactants which are formed here by this lining the entire fluid, air fluid interface, and when needed they are degraded. Okay, what are the components of this? Dipalmityl phosphatidylcholine is a major component, 62%. What else is there? Phosphatidyl, cholesterol is there, other phospholipids are there, neutral lipids are there, protein is there, some amount of carbohydrate is there. Okay, so again, we understood this. Now, what impact does a surfactant create? When a surfactant is there, one, surfactant has, I told you it's similar to a phospholipid. So it has a hydrophilic area head and a hydrophobic tail. Hydrophobic tail is going to go out into the air. So it has a way by which now all directions there is a pull because of this. And it reduces the amount of your water cells or fluid which is interacting at the air fluid interface. It's sort of like competition. Okay, it reduces the amount which is interacting, thus reducing the surface tension. So this surfactant, apart from your phosphatidylcholine that we're talking about, it has certain apoproteins also in it. Okay, so these apoproteins are SPA, B, C, D. SPA and SPD are involved in innate immunity. The SPB is involved in formation of tubular myelin. Both SPB and C help in formation of that monolayer of that we saw earlier of surfactant. Okay. Now, what are the functions of surfactant? This can come as a question by itself. Pretty simple. Okay, the first 4 points are actually one single thing, but you can write it as separate points for the sake of exams. So first thing, what is happening? There is decrease in surface tension, as we showed earlier. You can draw the diagram and explain. Around 2 to 10 fold of surface tension decreases there. So when surface tension decreases, what happens? It prevents the collapse of alveoli, Laplace law. We are talking about it. Okay, so now that collapse of the alveoli will be prevented, and hence lungs become more compliant. When lungs is more compliant, we do not have to result in so much extra change in the pressure to result in a volume increase. So the work that we give is also reduced. They're all related. So first, surface tension is reduced. It prevents the collapse of alveoli. Lung becomes more compliant, and the work of breathing decreases. Okay. Now, apart from that, these apoproteins that we saw involved in innate immunity. So these proteins are involved in defense. They're also involved in assisting the ciliary movement. Now, apart from this, it helps keep the alveolar dry. How does it help keep the alveolar dry? So imagine a spherical surface like this, and it is filled with water. Okay, the most energetically favorable position for water to exist is not like this. See, water is here like this. Always, if water particles are there in a format like this, then it will try to become one single fluid that is more energetically favorable. So what it will do, it will try to pull from the interstitial fluid more water. Okay, because of this surface tension which is there. But the surfactant will reduce the surface tension and hence reduce this tendency. Hence keeping the alveolar dry. Another thing, braking action of surfactant on inflation to keep the alveolar size relatively uniform during respiratory cycle. What does it mean? So say there is this much, okay, and you have say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 surfactant molecules. Now this goes up and inflates and reaches this diameter. It's not like your surfactant molecules increase. It's still 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But the surface area has increased so much. That by itself will produce more surface tension and break this inflation. Thus, relatively trying to keep your diameter of the alveoli in a normal range. Imagine it's going down. Okay. Instead, it's going this small. It's still the same number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Surfactants cannot be broken down very fast. Okay, now surface tension has dropped so low. Okay, so because of this two, end effects, it is always able to maintain a stable alveolar size. So these are different functions of surfactants. Okay, what is the principle of interdependence? Each alveoli is tethered to adjacent alveoli. So even without surfactants, even if the collapse, you can only proceed so far where they all, are tethered to each other and will prevent the collapse of the other one. Then what other factors that increase and decrease surfactant? Thyroid hormone, glucocorticoid, increase surfactant. That is why, if a premature baby is born, okay, so the surfactant is less at that point in a premature baby. So often before delivery, we give glucocorticoids to the mother to make sure to increase the production of surfactant in the child. Apart from that, cigarette, if you cut vega and all, pulmonary artery is occluded, bronchus is occluded, or very importantly, long-term inhalation of 100% oxygen. So 100% oxygen is not a good thing. If you give a newborn baby 100% oxygen for a long time because you think it's good, it will reduce the surfactant. Okay, so these two are two important things you need to remember. So take a look at this question. Surfactant plays a crucial role in maintaining alveolar stability by reducing surface tension, thus preventing collapse. What prevents small alveoli from collapsing during exhalation? Surfactant reducing surface tension. Reduction in surfactant levels will primarily result in collapse of the alveoli. Okay, so we will now talk about Auricle. And Auricle has basic, foundational classes, which are pre-recorded sessions, which are there. Over 100 hours of physiology lectures are made available. There are live sessions which are there, where you can, come online, interact with the teacher, understand it, and you get the feeling of being in a class. There's the express exam module, where right before the exam, you can take this up and complete the entire syllabus in less than 20 hours. Hard copy note sets are there with, MCQs, flow charts, diagrams, and all that. And there are question banks which are available with different difficulties of questions. Pre-recorded practical sessions are also made available in the app. And these are the various subscription plans which are currently there. And you can use my code, Dr. Shakthinag 20 for discount on subscription. So thank you for watching. In case you want to contact Team Auricle, these are the various social media handles.